everyone. I'm very happy to open the fifth and final session of our cycle, Rethinking Psychoanalysis in Central Europe, Interdisciplinary and Transnational Perspectives. And today we will reflect on Jewish women in psychoanalysis with our two special guest speakers, Dr. Anna Borgos and Dr. Clara Naszkowska. And after their presentations, we will have a discussion with Dr. Clara Royer, Dr. Mateusz Chmurski, and Dr. Mathieu.
I have a PowerPoint presentation which I try to share. So I'd like to talk about the women of the Budapest School of Psychoanalysis, the early women analysts at the early 20th century. But first, I would say a few more general words about the relationship of women and psychoanalysis in the early 20th century, because it's partly corresponding to Hungarian women as well, but I think there are some more general phenomena around it. So psychoanalysis was a relatively accessible field for middle-class women, at least at the beginning of the 20th century, even compared with other fields of sciences. One reason for the interest and mutual openness was that in psychoanalytic thinking and practice, a particular blend of the traditional female and the modern intellectual roles could be realized. Favorable social circumstances met a new, freshly developing profession's need for receptive followers, regardless of their sex. Although numerically this is the story of a narrow group of women, it is linked with contemporary culture and society in many ways. Therefore, through their life stories, not only the history of psychoanalysis, but also the social political developments in Hungary and the region can be reconstructed. Their careers partly reflect similar tendencies insofar as they often developed alongside identities of Jewish origin, gender, and profession, and are closely linked with the history of assimilation, emigration, and cultural changes. So some numbers and ratios. In the interwar period, the proportion of women in psychoanalysis was already higher than in any other branch of science internationally. In the 30s, on a European average, their presence reached 30%. And you can see the change of numbers throughout the years. So in the 30s, it was already about 30%. And as a comparison, in medicine, it was the proportion of women was only 5%. So it seems to be somehow a more open and maybe more a mutual attraction between psychoanalysis and women. Although men were largely in charge of the analytic institutions from the 20s, leading positions were taken by an increasing number of women as training analysts, teachers, editors, or professors. Many of them gained a high reputation after their flight from Europe to England and to the United States, like Anna Freud, Melanie Klein, Helena Deutsch, Karen Horney, or Margaret Mahler. Regarding the Vienna Psychoanalytical Society, some more numbers, between 1910 and 1937, you can see that the ratio of women increased from 2% to 45% during these years. The very first woman, Margareta Hilferding, entered the society in 1910. This tendency was also reflected by the Hungarian Psychoanalytical Association, in which, so the proportion of women was about 15% by the mid-20s. It was about 30% in the early 30s, and it was almost 50% by the second half of the 30s, which was, according to the members list, actually the highest proportion globally. And yes, also after the war, you can see that it exceeded the number of men, but it's complicated because it was mostly due to the Holocaust, in which men, as well, also in the concentration camps and labor service, affected men more than women. So it was not only because there were so much more women in the society, but the proportion of men was strongly and tragically reduced. So if one tries to find the roots of this relatively strong presence of women, so one may consider a set of social and science historical and psychological factors, and I would say a few words about this. Well, one obvious reason is that the expansion of the analytic profession happened at a time when women's social opportunities were broadening in general in the fields of education and work. For example, in 1896, the faculties of medicine, pharmacology, and the humanities opened for women in Hungary. Is it, you can read these words, or is it unreadable, completely unreadable?
We can see it.
Yeah. Read it. Okay. So this is one thing. Another a typical phenomenon that is that marginalized groups of society usually have more favorable possibilities to enter newly emerged, less established professions with less rigid professional and gender hierarchies. So the young and in many respects only forming and institutionalizing science of psychoanalysis attracted many women and was open for women as well. And just as it was just a side aspect that the so-called lay analysis, the practice of psychoanalysis without a university degree, was accepted in both Vienna and Budapest, which might have also facilitated the involvement of women, especially since the medical faculty of the Budapest University applied a numerus nullus for women between 1920 and 1926. Thirdly, although psychoanalysis was a modern science, psychotherapy still involved values which were traditionally linked with the feminine, such as empathy, attention, emotionality, and caring, which might have become expertise in the framework of a developing progressive trend. And partly, we can see that a partly gender-based division of role appeared in the profession as well. The roles of informal organizing and supporting activities were typically performed or mostly performed by women. And approaching it from another angle, in a symbolic sense, certain patterns of the cultural notion of the feminine can be discovered in psychoanalysis itself and the way it was received. It was the other language, the taxonomically unclassifiable entity. It was qualified as outside science from a positivist viewpoint. And the need to abandon traditional roots was a common feature of intellectual women and psychoanalysis. So there are these kind of bit more abstract, but also practical parallels between psychoanalysis, the position of psychoanalysis and women. And also an important aspect was Ferenczi's openness and affirmative attitudes, which definitely inspired women to enter the profession. Furthermore, his motherly intersubjectivity, commitment to curing, openness for experimenting, as well as his interest in the early mother-infant relationship were also attributes that women analysts could easily relate to. And there was also a role of Jewishness, which I will talk about soon a bit more. Just I'd like to have a brief overview about the socio-cultural background and some other parameters of some significant Hungarian women analysts, because well, it's we can reveal a couple of similar features in these socio-cultural factors. They almost all of them, actually all of them, came from educated Jewish middle-class intellectual trader families from Budapest or the countryside. The Jewish, but mostly converted, Christian converted families, so assimilated Jewish families. And so here we can think about the role of Jewishness, the social historical significance. And we might say that in the case of assimilated middle-class Jews, there was apparently a greater openness towards modern women's roles, and also a stronger ability and force to social mobility. Emancipation in religion and gender roles was equally influential. Education for daughters was increasingly considered a value, cultural, family, and marriage capital, or in fact an alternative to marriage in some cases. So if we consider the education of these, educational background of these women, well, of course, it's just not all of the women analysts. These are just some significant examples. So most of them had a university degree in medicine or the humanities. A few of them did not have a degree, but were as lay analysts, like Edith Gyömrői, for example, or well, Vilma Kovács, or actually Alice Balint also didn't. She studied in different universities, but she didn't have a diploma. So if we regard their institutional positions or posts, it was typically developed around treatment or therapy, teaching, organizing, and promoting roles. Although after the Second World War, many of them were appointed to leading positions in various institutions. But yeah, so before the war, it was not typical that they got into leading institutional positions. And after the war, of course, it was not within the field of psychoanalysis anymore, because psychoanalysis itself was not, was repressed. So what kind of social or intellectual movements did they join? Well, we can say that all of them had left-wing commitments, but only a minority actively took part in social movements. They apparently didn't have a direct relationship, for example, with the contemporary vivid feminist movement, but some of them, for example, Alice Balint gave lectures at the invitation of the Feminist Association. And so here we can think about also the question of whether, what Nancy Chodorov wrote about whether how important their gender was for these women, actually. And she concludes that being a woman was not so important for the early women analysts compared to their professional identities or their Jewish identity, which were common with men, actually. So, and I can partly reinforce this conclusion, but at the same time, reading, for example, personal documents, correspondence, diaries of these women, it's quite apparent that they did struggle with conflicts of their gender and profession and whatever, motherhood and marriage versus profession. For example, Alice Balint's diaries are when she was in analysis with Ferenczi, she was struggling about these questions. And then there are some other examples for that. In Lili Hajdú's correspondence, for example, that she is a girl of tomorrow, and so on and so on. So this was present. I think the gender problem was present, but it's true that they didn't have like a very categoric or visible feminist identity or attachment, or there's no trace of that, or this kind of connection, which I think in Austria, for example, it was a stronger connection between the feminist movement and psychoanalysis. Okay, and some words about the family life of these women. If we look at their partners and children, we see that they it's remarkable that they very often share the profession or professional interests with their husband, or even they shared even works. They had works in common. For example, the Balint couple or the Herman, Imre and Alice Herman, worked together on different subjects, and they lived in an apparently equal companionship, comparing to the age, to the era, and they typically had one or two children, or they didn't have a child, some of them. So it was definitely less than the average, and two of them divorced, Vilma Kovács and Edith Gyömrői. Gyömrői had divorced even twice. She had 3 husbands, which was also quite unusual in the era. So their way of life, in this sense, or their private life, was a bit different from the average or traditional women of the era. And of course, they probably couldn't have realized it without an equal marriage or an equal partnership. As for their fields of interest or fields of expertise, it seems that their activity was mainly linked with the early mother-infant relationship, child analysis, education, or female sexuality. And of course, they had some other interests as well, but these were some typical examples. And we can say that this tendency partly reflects on women's roles in society, or women's characteristics or interests. At the same time, as central and constitutive subject matters of psychoanalysis, and within that the Budapest School and Ferenczi, these cannot be regarded as specifically feminine fields of interest. So like the early mother-infant relationship, it was not, I think it was not a female field of interest, but a very, par excellence, an interest of psychoanalysis itself. But of course, perhaps it was easier for women to connect to this subject. And women often approach these issues from a different viewpoint. And from the 1930s, with the opening of the psychoanalytic polyclinic in Budapest, child analysis and the issue of education became more important or highlighted, and women's increasing presence may be interconnected to that as well. As for the emigrations, the two major waves of emigration appear in almost all life histories. I guess Judith Mészáros also talked about it, and she wrote about it a lot. In 1919, after the short-lived communist republic, for example, Edith Gyömrői and Alice Balint migrated to Vienna and Berlin, partly for political reasons and partly with the aim of studying, which, due to the numerus clausus law, also qualified as a political reason, actually, but without the intention of final settlement. After 1938, emigration was clearly a flight from the persecution of Jews, a state of exile with the destinations of England, United States, Australia, and Ceylon. We can say the concrete names and destinations. And so this kind of displacement did not only mean, of course, geographical migration, but implied shifts in scientific views, social circumstances, languages, professions, and sometimes family situations as well. So it was a much more complex shift than just a scientific shift, but the international network of psychoanalysis was of help this kind of accommodation or adaptation in many cases, not always. For example, as we'll see, in the case of Edith Gyömrői in Ceylon, it was very difficult to start or restart psychoanalysis because of the lack of institutional background or the difference of culture. So she started other things. So now, oh yes, and I think it's not very visible. It's also Judith Mészáros poster with the Hungarian psychoanalytic tree with analysts and analysans. And I just wanted to show it because I was curious about whether there was any female network within these analyst-analysant relations or within the profession. And we can say that around Vilma Kovács, there was this kind of matrilinear relationship. She analyzed several women like Lili Hajdú, Alice Herman, Erzsébet Kardos, for example. And so she was a kind of a role model for these women as well. And yes, and for her daughter, Alice Balint, definitely. So now I would just briefly introduce some lives and oeuvres of some significant early Hungarian analysts. One of them was Lili Hajdú, who she lived through the Second World War, and her life stories and especially tragic emblem of how politics and psychoanalysis were interlocked in the 20th century. She was born in an assimilated Jewish family in Miskolc, in a northern Hungarian city. She graduated in medicine in Budapest as one of the first female students. During the 1910s, she was a member of the Galileo Circle, free thinker, intellectual student society. And she began to work at the psychiatric clinic of the university. Then after the First World War, she became the director of an institute treating mentally handicapped people, it's a free institute, which she then transformed into an institute for nervous children, together with her husband, physician Miklós Gimes. Her work focused on the psychoanalytic treatment of schizophrenia, and she published studies about schizophrenia. Her husband, who was being trained as an analyst, was deported during the Second World War and died in a concentration camp. Lili Hajdú survived the Holocaust hiding in Budapest. And after the war, she became, for a short while, she became the president of the Hungarian Psychoanalytical Society from 1947 until its forced dissolution in 1949. So it was quite an ungrateful role in this period. So from then on, actually, she couldn't practice her psychoanalytic profession and interest during the, but she at the same time she got into important positions. For example, in the 1950s, she was, for a while, she was the director of the institution of, she was the director of the National Institute of Neurology and Mental Disorders, the so-called Lipótmező. And so she had to take part in the so-called Pavlovization of psychology and psychiatry, which was quite a big conflict in her professional interests. And her son, Miklós Gimes Jr., was one of the ideological leaders of the 56 revolution and the tertiary accused of the Imre Nagy trial, and he was executed in 1958. And Lili Hajdú's daughter migrated to Switzerland in 56, so she wanted to join her and her family, but she didn't get a passport, and she kept asking or requesting, but when her passport request was refused for the third time, she committed suicide in 1960. So it was so it was quite a tragic, tragically ended life course, partly because of the status of psychoanalysis, partly because of her political, or politics itself, and so it was actually as Sándor Révész put it, the side effect or the side death of a politically constructed death of Miklós Gimes. I mean her suicide. So yes, some old pictures from her old age. Another very turbulent life course was that of Edith Gyömrői, who was probably a record holder in changing her residence name and profession. She became interested in psychoanalysis through her uncle, István Hollós. After the fall of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, she migrated to Vienna. Then in the 20s, she lived in Berlin, and she was trained to be a psychoanalyst in Berlin with Otto Fenichel, but she also, before that, she worked in different, she made did different works, like she was a costume designer at the Neumann Production film studio and so on. But already in the 20s, she opened her own practice, and she joined the circle of Marxist analysts such as Annie and Wilhelm Reich, Otto Fenichel, Edith Jacobson, and Siegfried Bernfeld, and she was part of this so-called children's seminar. So she lived in Berlin until 1933, until Hitler came to power. Then she moved to Prague and lived there for a while, and then returned to Budapest in 34, where she held seminars for mothers and educators and pursued analysis, for example, to the poet, the famous or to be famous poet Attila József. Then in 1930, this was the Berlin years and the Budapest years. So in 1938, together with her third husband, they immigrated to Ceylon. They got an immigration permit to Ceylon, where she started to give lectures and seminars on psychoanalysis, but struggled with the difference of culture and institutional background. So she tried to adapt herself to the local culture and started to study Buddhist philosophy and wrote her dissertation on this topic in 44, entitled Miracle and Faith in Early Buddhism. She also founded a weaving school for village women. You can see a picture on this. And she was also involved in the local leftist and women's politics. She met her fourth husband, Charles Ludovic, Shakespeare researcher and head of the English department at the University of Colombo. So she lived in Ceylon until 56, when the couple moved to London, and Gyömrői joined the staff of the Hampstead Clinic and became part of Anna Freud's circle, running her practice until the age of 80. Her best-known paper is The Analysis of a Young Concentration Camp Victim, which was published in 63, I think, and it was translated into various languages. Her autobiographical novel manuscript, Gegen den Strom, Against the Current, was published in Germany in 2014 and in Hungarian in 2015. Okay, I don't know how much time I have, but just showing some pictures and saying a few words about Vilma Kovács, who was an early important figure of the Hungarian psychoanalytic history. She was born in Szeged, in a South Hungarian town, in a Jewish trader's family, and married at a very young age to her first husband, and had 3 children from this first husband. The oldest one was Alice Székely-Kovács, whom we know as Alice Bálint after her husband Michael Bálint. And she got into analysis with Ferenczi towards the end of the First World War, and this therapy was developed into a training analysis and a master-student relationship. And in the 20s, she started her own analytic practice. She translated Freud's essay, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, into Hungarian. She published a few studies, but she mostly organized, trained, and analyzed. She also served as an influential model for her younger female colleagues, creating a personal and professional network around her. Through her second husband, a wealthy architect, she provided significant financial support to the society, and due to that, the Hungarian Polyclinic could open in 31, headed by Ferenczi and then Michael Mihály Bálint. So her main field of interest was the process of the analytic training, and she is referred most widely in this respect until today. Following Ferenczi, she organized and described the so-called Hungarian, this is the building of today's building of the building where the Polyclinic was, but I think the building itself doesn't exist today. So following Ferenczi, she organized and described the so-called Hungarian training system, whose specialty was that, or is that, the first cases of the trainee are supervised by her own training analyst and discussed in an analytic situation, in the so-called control analysis. Wilma Kovács became the manager of Ferenc's scientific legacy. After her death, it was taken by her son-in-law, Michael Balint, and then by her granddaughter, Judith Dupont, as you probably know it. In 1938, she moved to Paris with her husband to her younger daughter, but then they returned to Budapest before the outbreak of the Second World War, and she died in 1940, 1 year surviving her daughter, Alice Balint. Some words about Alice Balint as well, because she was also a very important figure of the Hungarian psychoanalysis, the daughter of Wilma Kovács. During her very short life course of only 41 years, she carried on rich theoretical, therapeutic, and education activities. With a new approach of the mother-child relationship, she was one of the forerunners of the object relation theory. She studied different disciplines in different universities, mathematics, law, ethnology, Budapest, Vienna, Berlin. They moved to Berlin in the early 20s with Michael Balint, and started analysis with Hans Sachs, but they were not satisfied with that, so they returned to Budapest and continued it finished it with Ferenc. She also had an important educational activity for a wider audience, and wrote about various taboo issues too, like onanism or sexual education. Her book, a gyermekszoba pszichológia, sorry, I forgot to move on. Her book, The Psychology of the Nursery, was translated into German, French, Spanish, and English. In 1939, the couple emigrated to Manchester, where Alice Balint died very, very shortly after their arrival, only some months after their arrival, in ruptured aneurysm. So it was a very sudden stop of her career and life, but it was still a very theoretical. Perhaps she had among the women, she had the most theoretically rich oeuvre, even within this short life course. Okay, so I think I just show some more pictures of, for example, Lilian Rotter, who was active in psychoanalytic pedagogy and education, and she wrote an interesting paper on female sexuality as well. Erzsébet Révész, who was the very first member of the Hungarian Society, and as well as the Vienna Society, and a patient of Freud for a few years. Margit Dubovits was the head of the Hungarian, the Polyclinics Educational Guidance Center. And conducted child analytic seminars in contact with Anna Freud's seminars in Vienna. Alice Hermann was, well, the wife of Imre Hermann on the one hand, but she was very practiced psychoanalytic work as well, but after the war, she got more involved in educational psychology and kindergarten and school teacher training. Clara Lazar was a colleague, so she was together with Margit Dubovits. She also led consultations in this education guidance center, and she emigrated to Australia in 1940, where she basically established the Australian psychoanalytic, or the Melbourne Psychoanalytic Institute. She was the first training analyst of the Melbourne Psychoanalytic Institute, and in 1952, she co-founded the Australian Psychoanalytical Society and served as its president for many years. Erzsébet Kardos, well, she's one of my favorites. She had a very short life course as well. She studied medicine at the University of Peach, and then after the numerus clausus in Würzburg in Germany, and after some years of work at the Schlossmann Clinic in Düsseldorf, she was invited to Colombia, to South America, where she worked as a pediatrician, and started expeditions to the Guajiro Indian tribe, which was reported in the Hungarian daily press a few times. And when she returned to Budapest, she started her analysis with Vilma Kovács. And with her husband, Endre Pető, they worked together on the meta-psychological description of play. And in 1939, they got an immigration permit to Australia, but they decided to stay in Budapest, unfortunately, and they were hiding with false papers during the Nazi occupation and the Aerocross power, and someone then, and in the end, someone reported Kardos, and she was killed by an Aerocross squad at almost the very last minute in January 1945. And there are some very well-known women as well with Hungarian origin: Margaret Mahler and Therese Benedek, Schönberger Margit and Friedman Therese, their original names. I won't introduce them because their careers are quite well known. So just to end up with a few conclusions, it seems that there was a mutually open relationship of psychoanalytic profession and women analysts, but they had a manifold social determinations. The 20th century status of being a Jew, a woman, and a psychoanalyst were highly fluctuating in the region and threatened in either one or the other phase rejection and restriction. While around the turn of the 20th century, being a woman was a stronger obstacle to attending higher education or starting an academic career. From the 20s and 30s, it was Jewish origin that increasingly became the basis for restriction and exclusion. And from the 1950s, psychoanalysis itself became repressed for about 3 decades. On the other hand, the active presence of women in psychoanalysis in Hungary was due to the fact that their careers began in those decades when being a woman was not already and being Jewish was not yet an obstacle to continuing their profession. It was even a facilitating social circumstance. Yeah, so these analysts was in a special dual position. This is also somewhat apparent in their work. They approach their subject often from a new original point of view, while simultaneously they were sometimes less able to break away from Freudian influences than some of their male colleagues. And this also visible in the institutional positions. We see them typically in the roles of therapist, trainer, translator, organizer, or mediator, and less as institutional leaders or theoretical theorist, or yeah, at least with some important examples, of course. While they brought significant new aspects to traditionally feminine, but for the Budapest school, essential fields, such as the early mother-infant relationship, education, or female sexuality or some other areas like the training system, psychoanalytic ethnography, or the therapy of schizophrenia. And they contributed to, this way they contributed to extending the framework of both femininity and psychoanalysis by presenting new role models and ways of life, and by rethinking theoretical concepts and therapeutic methods as well. So I stop here. Thank you for your attention. I recommend you my book as well. And
well, we've known each other for a while, so I know that we work on very similar group of women, although Anna focuses on the Hungarian women, as you know, and I focus on those who immigrated, Agnieszka just said, to the United States. So I just want to really quickly say that this presentation is a part of a much larger project. So I will be talking about 5 women today, but the whole project is devoted to 86. This is the number of women psychoanalysts who immigrated from Europe, fleeing the Nazis between 1933 and 1942 to the United States. So there's 86 of them. I'm not going to ask, but if you take a second to think about how many names do you remember, that's probably going to be 5 or 10, and we here know a little bit more about psychoanalysis. So it's just about so many of them have been completely erased from the recorded past. But today I will be talking about 5 of them, 5 women who created a group that was called the Black Cat Group in Vienna, and then all of them immigrated to the United States. And my presentation is based on, so I'm not a psychoanalyst, I'm a cultural historian, social historian, and a personal historian. So this research I've been doing is mostly archival research, and a lot of information I've been gathering and using to create portraits of those women is based on personal histories, so on memoirs, correspondence, interviews, and so on and so on. And also I've been talking to, I've been doing this for 2.5 years now, so I've been talking to children and grandchildren, friends, best friends, colleagues of those women as well, to have a fuller picture. So I'm not focused on their psychoanalytic ideas, I'm focused on their identities, who they were, their experiences, how they dealt or didn't deal with traumas and losses, and so on and so on. So this is an example. And I've titled this presentation, Help, Health, Husbands, and Chutzpah, because this is based on something that reportedly one of those women, Marianne Chris, said when she was asked how did she survive all of this, everything that happened to her. And she said, you need the 3 H's. You need good help, good health, and a good husband. And then another one of those women, Jenny Valder-Hall, when she heard that that was Marianne Chris's reply, she said, there's a 4th H, chutzpah. So let me start by quickly introducing this group. So the Black Cat Group consisted of 10 people, 5 women and their husbands. And I'm not going to talk about the husbands, but I feel it's maybe I should mention their names at least. So we had Helena and Felix Deutsch, Greta and Edward Bibring, Dora and Heinz Hartman, Marianne and Ernst Chris, and Jenny Valder-Hall and her husband, Robert Walder. And they started meeting in Vienna every Saturday evening in the mid-1920s. And they continued until the first one of the group, Helena Deutsch, immigrated to the United States in September 1935. The name of the group, the Black Cat, came from a card game that was a variant of whist, but that was just a pretext. They met to discuss psychoanalytic developments, ideas, patient cases, and also broad cultural, social, and political issues. Usually they met at Helena Deutsch's house, Helena and Felix Deutsch's house. who lived in a gorgeous apartment in the very center of Vienna. They occasionally met at other members' homes, but according to Jenny Walder-Hall, they preferred to meet at the Deutsches because they had an excellent cook. But it's also worth pointing out that at that time, so in the mid-1920s and in the early 1930s, Helena Deutsch was already a well-respected, recognized psychoanalyst known internationally. She was born in 1884, which made her the group's only woman to represent the first generation of psychoanalysts. The first generation is understood here as those born in 1870s, 1880s. And the other four women were all born, were all representatives of the second generation, so those born at the turn of the century through 1910s. So Jenny Walder-Hall was born in 1898, then Greta Bibring the year later, Marianne Chris 1 year later, and Dora Hartman 1902. In the January 1925, Helena Deutsch became the first director of the newly opened Vienna Training Institute. She was appointed the year before, but the institute started running January 1925. And that year, 1925, Greta Bibring had only just qualified as a doctor and started seeing adolescents. And Dora Hartman, Marianne Chris, and Jenny Walder-Hall were still in medical school. Another factor that could be considered is that Helena Deutsch was seen by many younger analysts as a domineering, overshadowing, quote, titan who represented the Orthodox establishment of the Syncretic movement in Vienna, and someone who had decisive influence on their lives. For example, Margaret Mahler's famously quoted, well, talked about Helena Deutsch's influence on her life. But on the other hand, Helena Deutsch saw herself as a representative of a younger liberal generation of psychoanalysts. So Anna talked a little bit about who those women were, the women of those two generations of psychoanalysts, the first and second generation, and what she said fully overlaps with what my findings have been, although she mostly researches the Hungarian women, and I researched those who immigrated to the US, but this, of course, to some point overlaps. So they were the so-called new women, which are now defined as university women of the early 20th century who sought personal self-fulfillment through higher education and chose careers in fields that were traditionally male and dominated by men. So also typically for the new women, all 5 women of the Black Cat group were Jewish and by birth, and all of them had 2 Jewish parents. Also typically, they came from culturally and socially assimilated families. Anna mentioned that many of the families of the Hungarian women converted. That's something that I have not come across at all, but they did come from culturally, socially assimilated families, from wealthy, middle to upper class, and their parents were usually either non-observant or observed just some of the Jewish holidays and customs. Only few of those 86 that I've been researching came from Orthodox families. So due to a combination of cultural, social, legal, and personal reasons, usually mothers of professional women in the early decades of the 20th century, including physicians and psychoanalysts, didn't have university education and were usually homemakers. At the same time, typically their fathers and other family members like uncles and brothers were cultural professionals. They usually attended university or at least graduated from a gymnasium. And they were typically doctors, lawyers, or businessmen, also usually well-known and respected in the local Jewish communities. So again, typically, the new women usually identified with their fathers, who are better educated, more liberal, and they usually distanced themselves from their mothers, who were more conventional, less liberal, less educated, and even had Victorian values. So regarding the Black Cat women, all of whom became medical doctors, all of them graduated from the medical school at the University in Vienna, 2 fathers were lawyers, 2 were businessmen, and 1 was a renowned pediatrician, while all 5 of the mothers were homemakers. So just like a quick comment from a historian digging in archives and trying to reconstruct family histories, it's so much more difficult to unearth information about mothers than fathers, for a number of reasons. One is that I base a lot of my information on interviews that were conducted with those women after they came to the United States. And those interviews were usually conducted by psychoanalysts or doctors who were very rarely interested in personal details. So that's one thing. And then those women, if they started to talk about their families, they would very rarely talk about their mothers. They usually mentioned their fathers. Okay, so when I was looking at those 86 women that the whole group that my research is devoted to, I realized that a very large contingent of the first women psychoanalysts were born in then non-existing Poland. So that was actually the highest, I would say nationality, but that's of course tricky since Poland was then partitioned, but they did have Polish identity. So Polish language was the first language at their homes. That's why I decided, not because I am Polish and it's a great discovery, but because they had Polish identities. That was their first identity, and Polish language was the first language spoken at their homes. So back to this group of 5 women, 2 of the Black Cat women were born in Poland, both in Galicia, or Austrian Galicia, it's also called. So this part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was created in 1772 during the first partition of Poland and annexed to the Habsburg Empire. So that was Helena Deutsch and Jenny Walder-Hall. Those 2 came from Galicia. So at their birth, the identities of Helena Deutsch and Jenny Walder-Hall already consisted of 4 components. So like I said, it was a Polish component, it was a Jewish component, but also Galician and Austrian. So Helena Deutsch was born in 1884 in a mid-sized town of Przemysl, as it was then called. It was Przemyśl in Polish, and it's now Przemyśl in Poland, to a Jewish bourgeois family. When she was growing up, almost 40% of the town was Jewish, and there were many Jewish political and cultural organizations and institutions flourishing in Przemyśl. Her father, Wilhelm Rosenbach, was a prominent criminal lawyer, and he was a culturally assimilated, non-religious Jew who was nonetheless a very important figure in the Jewish community of the town. Their house, according to Helena Deutsch, was, quote, a microcosm of the Polish Jewish society of Przemyśl at that time, end of quote. So Wilhelm Rosenbach was also the first Jew ever to be appointed as a juridical representative of Galicia to the federal court in Vienna, which was basically unheard of for a Jew at that time to have that kind of a position. So according to her own words, she repeated this throughout many interviews and in her memoir, Helena Deutsch strongly identified with her father as his intellectual heir. And she repeatedly stated that, quote, I was his boy. In her memoir, she devoted only chapter 4 to her mother. After hometown, her father, and her sisters, the first 3 chapters. Her name was Regina, born as Fass, Regina Fass. She came from a well-to-do family, and she got married to Wilhelm when she was only 19. And that's more or less all we know about her mother. Helena Deutsch called her mother aggressive and, quote, imposing individual who ruled the model household like a despot from a throne situated in a niche of the dining room, end of quote. And she repeatedly stated that she absolutely hated her mother. Her compatriot, also from Galicia, Jenny Walder-Hall, was born in Lemberg, which is now Lviv in Ukraine, which was then the capital of Galicia and a cultural and academic center of East Central Europe. During the interwar, then Lwów in independent Poland, it became home to the country's third largest Jewish community. Her father, Jakob Polak, was a businessman engaged in international trade with neighboring countries. He was very well educated. Her mother, Amalia, came from a very religious family. And again, we don't know much more about her. We know that then that after the Battle of Lemberg in 1914, when the Russian army defeated the Austro-Hungarians, they were forced to immigrate. And that was the first forced migration from Jenny Walder-Hall, who was 15 at that time. Her family had to flee Russian-occupied Poland for Vienna. And they arrived as refugees, quote, stacked like cattle into trains, end of quote. From now on, Jenny Walder-Hall lived in Vienna, where she went to school and then graduated from the medical school until her second immigration to America. Greta Bibring was born in Vienna in a very wealthy intellectual bourgeoisie family. Her father, Moritz Lehner, was a well-educated businessman who was, according to his daughter, extremely well-read, a free thinker and social democrat. He owned a factory that produced margarine and synthetic cooking oils. His younger brother, Oskar Lehner, was the general manager of what was then the absolutely most luxurious hotel in Vienna. It was called the Hotel Imperial. You might have heard of it. This is where Freud's 80th birthday was hosted in 1936. And this is where Hitler stayed less than 2 years later, a little bit after 2 years later, a little more than 2 years later, right after Anschluss in March 1938. And he famously ordered to build a bunker under the hotel. But this is basically where every important person stayed and every important event that was to be hosted in Vienna took place. About Greta Biebering's mother, again, very typically, Greta says very little. Her name was Victoria, and she also came from Vienna. And according to Greta Biebering, her mother, quote, brought her up in a very Victorian spirit, and she was very sex rejecting, end of quote. Dora Hartman, also from Vienna, was born, had a very close relationship with her father, Sigmund Karplus, who was a doctor of law and who came from a small village in now Czech Republic. They were both adventurous mountaineers and naturalists. So they shared their passions. They spent a lot of time together. He encouraged her to climb the summits of the glaciated massifs, and she was possibly the first woman to climb the massive Piz Palu in Switzerland. Her mother, Ludmila, again, was very formal, old-fashioned, and dignified. That is according to her daughter. Marian Chris, the third of the Black-Hat women who was born in Vienna. Her father, Oskar Ree, was a very well-known and highly respected pediatrician. He was a very close friend of Sigmund Freud's. He assisted him in the first neurological researches that Freud did in the 1890s. He was an early member of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and he was a pediatrician to Freud's children. Marian Chris's mother, Melanie Ree, was a very well-off granddaughter of a sugar factory owner, and she was, according to her daughter, a very gifted and eager painter. So, and Marian Chris does not talk about rejecting her mother's lifestyle and values like all the other women, but she barely mentions her in interviews. So a little bit about their education. So Helena Deutsch, again, the only one of those women who represented the first generation of analysts, didn't have her parents' support to go into university, but she still decided to go against their wishes. So her mother, Regina, believed that, quote, a girl from a good family does not go to university, and she opposed her daughter's plan to study medicine. Helena Deutsch reports that she rebelled against her mother. She said, quote, my mother had no influence on my education, and her contribution to my intellectual values only existed in a negative sense. I reacted against hers, end of quote. However, even her father, whom Helena Deutsch idealized, was against the idea that his daughter went to university. So when she turned 14, Helena Deutsch, and graduated from a primary school, her parents believed that that would be the end of her education and that she would marry in the near future. Another obstacle to her path to university was that Helena Deutsch completed the primary school and not a gymnasium. A primary school provided, well, that was primary education, and a gymnasium, which was an 8 years long secondary school that provided college level education, was almost the only path to university. So it ended with a matura or an abitur, and that was how usually people got to university, with that diploma in hand. And Helena Deutsch didn't have that. But regardless of those impediments, she was determined to continue her education. So she came up with a plan. She went to her father and she said she will leave home and he will never hear of her again if he doesn't sign a contract with her in which he would agree to support her plan financially, to take the matura, that final exam, on her own, and he would help her by hiring tutors. He agreed, they signed the contract, and it took her about 5 years to get ready for the exam, and then she passed it on her own, and then she passed the university entrance exam. That was 1907. That university entrance exam was additionally required from those who didn't go to the gymnasium but wanted to go to university, even though she did have the matura. And it was more or less an unheard of situation, so that's what they came up with. And then, as a woman, she had to receive a special permission to take that exam. But she did all this, and in 1907, she became a medical student in Vienna. She initially wanted to follow her father into law, but that was not an option because women were not allowed to study law in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the first schools, law schools in Austria and then already independent Poland opened its doors to women in 1919. And at that time, Helena Deutsch was already a practicing psychoanalyst with a degree in psychiatry. So she initially went to Zurich and studied sociology for 1 year, but then she went back to Vienna and she enrolled in the famous medical school there, which was considered one of the, or even the best medical school at that time in Europe. She became one of only 7 women in her class of 500 to 600 students. Only 3 of those women would graduate, including, of course, Helena Deutsch. She said, quote, I was not interested in medicine, but she wanted to become a professional like her father, and she believed that medicine was the only way. So just to give you so that was 1919 for law schools, but medical schools in Austro-Hungarian Empire starting accepting women in 1900. And thanks to Anna, I know that in Hungary, it was an exception, 1896. Anna Borgos, I mean. So in Vienna and beyond, Jewish women made up a very high proportion of medical students. So just to give you an example, of the first 18 women who received medical degrees in Vienna by 1906, 2/3 were Jewish. I think Anna also mentioned a little bit why that was the case. I think there was a combination of socioeconomic and cultural factors contributed to why so many of women studying medicine were Jewish. So one thing is that a large part of them came from wealthy families. So their parents didn't have to worry about their daughters having to marry into wealth, and they could simply afford to educate them. So typically, like I said, their fathers had received some form of college level education, and they valued the benefits of higher education. So they simply wanted that for their daughters, and they were able to provide their daughters with financial as well as moral support to pursue university education and a professional career. In Jewish Orthodox families, there was also a custom that women combined household duties with professional work and contributed to family finances. Typically, daughters of Jews pursued university education in professions that were viewed as practical. So that included medicine, of course. When the black-haired women were studying in Vienna, Austrian universities were already prone to anti-Semitic bias, pressures, and violence. But this is like a big story, and I'm trying to not talk for 2 hours. But the reason I'm saying this is that the black-haired women didn't really talk about experiencing personal anti-Semitism as medical students. That doesn't mean that they did not experience it, but they didn't talk about it. Helena Deutsch said something in her memoir. She said, "I was born in anti-Semitic Poland, grew up in Vienna during its most intense anti-Semitic phase, but it was only in America that I encountered personal anti-Semitism for the first time." Some of them did recall gender discrimination at the university. For example, Helena Deutsch was repeatedly called Mr. Deutsch by one of the professors who believed that it's just impossible for a woman to be such a good student, and who was basically shocked at her extensive knowledge. He was known, his name was Chmurski. He was known to be a determined opponent of women's studies, and he was also a nationalist and an anti-Semite. So Helena Deutsch completed her studies in psychiatry in 1911 or 1913. And then the remaining 4 black-haired women also studied and graduated from the medical school in Vienna, but their paths to education were so much simpler than Helena Deutsch's. Most importantly, the parents of Greta Bibring, Dora Hartman, Jenny Valderhol, and Marianne Chris, they all supported their daughter's decision to pursue university education to various degrees that I'm going to get into details of that in a second. But because they endorsed their daughters getting an education, they all sent their daughters to a gymnasium, which, like I said, was such an easier step toward university. But also, apart from having their parents' support, they lived in a different Vienna. They lived in the so-called Red Vienna, which was liberal, progressive, and social democratic, and so much different to the Vienna that Helena Deutsch lived in and when she entered university. So when those 4 women, when they reached the age of matriculation, that was shortly after the First War, because that's when we have the Red Vienna phase, the world was buzzing with change, and one of those changes were women's rights. So from interviews with Greta Biebering, it can be gleaned that she had absolute freedom to decide about her education. She received primary education at home, and then she enrolled in a girls' gymnasium. This is how she describes a gymnasium. quote, I went to school in the morning, we stayed in school until 1, then I went home and I worked and prepared until about 10 in the evening, day after day after day. So we were really scholars. It had a medieval touch. We never, over 8 years talked about a boy. Never. We were much more discreet about it. End of quote. Before deciding for medicine, she considered becoming a classicist, botanist, and chemist. And then finally, after graduating from the gymnasium when she was 19, that was in 1918, she enrolled in a medical school. She said, quote, I always went my own way. I was a little bit of a maverick without knowing it, end of quote. And even her mother, who was like Greta, I quoted Greta saying that her mother was very conservative, didn't question her daughter's choice. She did make one objection after Greta had already matriculated. She didn't like the fact that her daughter was spending so much time with men in a study room. And Greta, as she says herself, she said herself, rebelled against that by getting married to one of those men that she was spending so much time with. And she was only 22. She married Edward Bibring, who also became an analyst later. That was in 1921. Greta Bibring did report gender discrimination similar to the one that Helena Deutsch encountered. So again, another professor didn't believe that a woman was able to become so prepared for an exam. So he kept on examining her for an entire day. And then at the very end, he did give her an excellent, but he didn't like that at all. Greta Biebering graduated with a degree in psychiatry in 1924. So then we have the family, the Polak family, which is such an interesting family. So this Jenny Valder Hall, who I will be talking about, who became a psychoanalyst, she was a middle daughter, but her older daughter Bettina, older sister Bettina and younger sister Helen were absolutely fascinating as well. And they all had PhDs and distinguished careers. So their father, as you can probably assume, was very vocal on the issues of women's education. And he reportedly said to his daughters, listen, kids, you won't get any dowry, but you will get an education, end of quote. And their mother, Amalia, also didn't oppose her daughter's decision to pursue university education. Amalia actually, in a way, contributed to their decision, to her daughter's decision to pursue a career and a profession, because at some point when her and her husband separated, she struggled financially, and that was something that that situation showed her daughters the value of financial independence from men. So Jenny Valder Hall began her education still in Lemberg, or Lviv, today's Lviv. And that was in a school that had been established by her grandfather's brother. She then attended a private girls' gymnasium, still in Lviv, where 99% of students were Jewish. And then after her family were forced to flee the city in 1914 and for Vienna, she enrolled in the girls' gymnasium and then graduated from it. And that gymnasium was established and run by her older sister, Bettina, who actually established a number of schools. After graduating from the gymnasium, Jenny Valder Hall entered the medical school in Vienna. That was in 1919. And then she graduated in 1925 with a specialization in pediatrics. At the university, she met Greta Bibring, who sparked her interest in psychoanalysis. Dora Hartman also received primary education at home. Then she graduated from a gymnasium and enrolled in a medical school without any hurdles. She enjoyed full moral and financial backing of her family. Her father, with whom, as I mentioned before, she was very close and with whom she spent a lot of free time, fully supported her decision to become a doctor. Her mother was less vocal about it, but she herself had wanted to become a doctor. However, when Austrian medical schools finally started to admit women in 1900, Dora Hartman's mother was already 34 and she had 3 small children, so that was not an option for her. About her choice of medicine, Dora Hartman said the following, quote, "That was an old idea of mine. I was not even 10 years old when I decided I will become a doctor, and I will become a doctor who works with children." She graduated the same year as Jenny Walder-Hall, 1925, also with a specialization in pediatrics. Marianne Chris also received primary education at home from tutors, private tutors, and then she wanted to go to a gymnasium, but her family didn't regard her as, quote, terribly intelligent, and they worried about her alleged heart condition. So she was not allowed to go to a gymnasium. She was allowed to go to a lyceum, which was that primary school that also Helena Deutsch had attended. And that was something that she described the following way: a school that prepared for a nice housewife existence, end of quote. And she was not interested in that school at all. So she repeatedly asked her father to agree to a transfer to a gymnasium. And then finally he agreed. She was 14 at that time. So she went to a gymnasium, and then again, like all of them, enrolled in the medical school in Vienna. So she said about her choice to become a doctor the following, quote, "I was absolutely sure from 8 years on that I wanted to be a pediatrician and not waver for a moment from that time on. After all, I was obviously very much identified with my father and wanted to go into medicine," end of quote. So something that, so as I mentioned, Marianne Chris doesn't talk much about her father, Melania, but I've mentioned that the way that she herself described her mother as, quote, very related to other people, fair, very attentive, and also a confidant to many, including Anna Freud, it does seem to me that Melanie was a kind of a proto-analyst, and that's a connection that Marianne Chris did not, to my knowledge, recognize anyway. So Marianne Chris also graduated in 1925, also with a degree in pediatrics, like Jenny Walder-Hall and Dora Hartman. And she did not, Marianne Chris, Jenny Walder-Hall, or Dora Hartman did not mention any form of discrimination or anti-Semitism when they were studying. But of course, again, doesn't mean they did not encounter it. I mean, we could have a whole seminar about dealing with traumas and losses. So, but overall, just like a quick comment, talking about the past was not something that overall those 86 women I've been researching wanted to do. Very, very rarely they talked about the past. Very, very rarely they connected or reconnected their past identity with the present identity. So the fact that they didn't mention it doesn't really mean that they didn't encounter it. So now about Freud, those women and Freud. So in her first year of medical school in 1907, Helena Deutsch read Freud for the first time. She did it on her own. She simply picked up a book and started reading. And then she started attending the meetings of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society during the first war. We don't have the minutes from the wartime, so we don't know exactly when, but we know it happened during the war. And then she was elected to full membership in 1918, right after the war. In August of 1918, she approached Freud about a personal analysis, and they started an analysis that lasted for about 1 year. It was only 3 days a week for 1-hour sessions instead of the customary 6 times a week even at that time. And the main goal of the analysis was to train her. But then Freud broke the analysis and before it was complete, because he found a more interesting patient, adolescent. And that hurt Helena Deutsch very much. On the other hand, despite the fact that analysis with Freud was incomplete, the fact that she even had an analysis with the so-called professor secured her position both within the Viennese psychoanalytic movement and the International Psychoanalytic Association. So then, like I've mentioned this before, but most importantly, in 1924, the year that she turned 40, she was appointed the first director of the Vienna Training Institute that opened in January 1925. Greta Biebering also read Freud independently on her own in 1916. She was 17 at that time and in the 7th grade of the gymnasium. She remembered it the following way, quote, "In psychology class, one of the students got up and told us that her father, a physician in Vienna, had played cards with a friend, Dr. Freud, every Saturday. And Freud told him and the other men in the group that academic psychology figured out some very important parts of what is going on psychologically in people and what motivates them and what influences their lives, though they are not aware of it. And he called these factors unconscious factors," end of quote. So that information about the unconscious made Greta Bibring very curious. So on the way home that very day, that's how she recalls it anyway, she stopped at a bookstore and picked up one of Freud's books, and then she picked up another and another and another. And then 2 years later, and many Freud's books later, in 1918, that was her first year of medical school, she set up a Vienna seminar for sexology with 5 fellow students, including 3 future analysts, Otto Fennekel, Edward Biebering, her future husband, and Wilhelm Reich. The initiative came from Otto Fennekel, who after one of the classes passed around a note in which he said that some subjects are not being covered during the classes. So if you want to meet after, let's meet and talk. And Greta Bibring immediately decided when she got that note to join Fennekel, and she encouraged 2 of her, at that time already close colleagues, Edward Biebering and Wilhelm Reich, to do so as well. So they started meeting, initially talking about endocrinology, but then quickly moved to sexology and psychoanalysis. And that could have been actually that study group, where she was the only woman, that her mother was so worried about, her spending time studying with men only. And then they took advantage of that custom that Freud had, that he, each afternoon, he had a couple hours reserved for walk-ins, patients without appointments. So that's when they approached him. And they started asking him questions about his theories, about his books, and they started asking him what they should read next. And they, according to Greta Bibring, sometimes, quote, simply debated him, end of quote. Freud was very open to those debates and questions, and he invited all of them to join the Viennese Society as guests. At that time, as you probably know, there was no training institute in Vienna, and training was very informal, and most of the training happened through attending meetings of the society, listening to lectures or giving presentations. So in 1924, Greta Bibring, when she qualified as a doctor, still there was no institute, which opened the next year. And the next day, so she qualified as a doctor, became a doctor, but the next day she started seeing adolescents. So her training was incredibly, it was just very different from what happened after the institute started to open and what is happening now. And then a few years later, she also opened a joint psychoanalytic practice with her husband, private practice with her husband. As a medical student, Greta Bibring was spreading interest in psychoanalysis among her friends, including Jenny Walder-Hall, who also became a guest member of the Viennese Society in 1922. Marian Christ knew Freud personally since birth. He was a guest home at her family home every weekend. He came for Saturday card party. He came on Sundays for dinner with his wife. And the family anecdote is that he actually picked up Marianne's name when the family couldn't decide on how to call her, because he just popped in and he suggested Marianne. But she became intellectually interested in psychoanalysis in medical school, in the first years of her medical school. And then she had a personal analysis with Freud that lasted for several years, for 7 years more or less, but with long interruptions. And that concluded with Marianne becoming a member of the Viennese Society. That's how she summarized her choice to become a psychoanalyst, quote, "So it surely had its line from the identification with my father, and then I shifted it to the best friend or one of the best friends of my father," by which she obviously means Freud. So distinct among this group, Dora Hartman didn't become an analyst in Europe. Before immigration, she worked as a pediatrician in many hospitals. She published pediatric papers and she opened a private pediatric practice. But then in late 1920s, she became a member of that Black Cat group, and she was absolutely a full member of the group, participating in every meeting and speaking up, listening to the discussions. And her closest friends were the Chrises, the Biberings, the Deutsches, and Jenny Walder-Hall and Robert Walder. She also attended IPA congresses, and she was very close friends with Willy Hofer as well, to whom she referred children with psychological problems that she was treating as a pediatrician. She started to arrange for training analysis with Anna Freud, but her husband, Heinz Hartman, who was a well-known analyst at that time, 8 years her senior, opposed that idea, so she dropped it at that time. I think I need to skip a little bit here. So very shortly about their choice, the family choices, I think. So all of those women got married, and all of them got married to prospective psychoanalysts. All with the exception of Heinz Hartman, whom I've just mentioned was 8 years his wife's senior. All of those men were their wife's peers. And all of those women, all 5 of the Black Cat women, married late for that time period, with the exception of Greta Bibring, whom I've mentioned before. She rebelled against her mother and got married at 22. So 4 of those women, again, the Hartmans are an exception, became professionally interested in Freudian theory and entered the psychotic circles at the same time as their husbands. They inspired and encouraged one another to enter personal training analysis to become psychoanalysts, and they discussed their cases because that was also something that was happening at that time. All of the husbands, again with the exception of Heinz Hartman, were of Jewish descent. And all women had children relatively late for their time. Jenny Walder-Hall first became a mother at 34, Helena Deutsch 33, Dora Hartman was 32, Marianne Chris and Biebering were 31. Each of them, with the exception of Helena Deutsch, had 2 children. She had only 1. And that's also similar to what Anna mentioned, was a generational difference between them and their mothers, who had 3 or 4 children. And that was very typical. So now about immigration. So despite the events that were happening in Germany, starting in really 1930, but then escalating quickly after Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, despite all of that was happening, Vienna-based intellectuals and professionals, including psychoanalysts, generally maintained an illusion that German fascism would be short-lived, and they felt relatively safe in Austria. So as a result, a large majority of analysts based in Austria at that time didn't leave the country until after the Anschluss, so after March 13th, 1938, that's the official Anschluss. Robert Walder, the husband of Jenny Walder Hall, in 1933, he was one of the very few who saw the handwriting on the wall and who recognized the seriousness of the Nazi threat. And he started to urge all of his friends, including the Black Cat friends, to leave Vienna immediately. But at the end, only the Deutsches left. Even Robert Walder and his wife didn't. So one of the factors behind Helena Deutsch's decision to immigrate was that she was worried about her son, Martin, who was, quote, filled with revolutionary zeal, and she was afraid that he would get in trouble. He was 17 at that time, so that was an idea, was that he would go on and study in the US, and he did. He graduated from MIT and was a pretty famous physicist. Another factor was that Helena Deutsch was looking for new professional opportunities beyond Vienna. And when she first visited America in 1930, she saw it as, quote, a haven for refugees persecuted in their own countries, end of quote. They went to Boston because Felix, her husband, Felix Deutsch, received an offer from the Massachusetts General Hospital, and that offer substantiated their visas. And then in Boston, there was a community waiting for Helena Deutsch, her former patients, her former students, because before the first training institutes opened in the US in the 30s, all of prospective American psychoanalysts that they wanted to train, they would go to Vienna or Berlin or a few other places, but mostly Vienna and Berlin. So she had her former students, she had friends. So Boston worked for her as well. And on her arrival, she, quote, had already filled up in advance almost all of her office hours with patients seeking analysis. So her successful career that she had in Vienna continued in the United States. She helped organize training of psychoanalytic candidates. She worked as an analyst. She was a president of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society. She wrote a lot as well. And I think I'm going to leave it at that about her career. She's one of those who's more known, but if you're interested, you can always follow up. So like I said, the remaining 4 couples stayed in Vienna until after the Anschluss. And Jenny Walder Hall and Robert Walder received a telegram from Helena Deutsch few days after the Anschluss, in which she said that she will sponsor them for a family visa. And they left Vienna immediately after receiving their visas. They traveled in April or May 1938. They landed in New York, like all of those refugees who went to the East Coast, but they decided to go to Boston, even though Jenny Walder Hall was repeatedly asked to stay in New York, for example, by Lawrence Kuby, but they wanted to go and be with join Helena Deutsch. Already on the boat, Jenny Walder Hall drew a hard line under the past. She said, quote, I was so disappointed in Nazi Vienna that I completely detached myself from Vienna. There was no mourning Vienna, no sadness in connection with it. It was gone, dismissed, end of quote. She also didn't feel like a refugee. She pretended that she's a tourist, visiting America as a tourist. She said she was treated like a diva. These are some quotes, but I'm going slightly quicker through this. And she was very determined to make Boston her new hometown as soon as possible. It was also easier for her in a way because she came with her 2 analysts who were American analysts who were returning to the US from Vienna. So she didn't have to reestablish herself from scratch professionally. By 1939, she was already very successful. She was earning good money. She had a nice house, and so on and so on. She became one of the founders of the Baltimore-Washington Institute. She also helped set up the Association for Child Analysis in Michigan, the Training Institute in Miami. She published little, but she was an incredibly influential teacher in a number of places. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. And if there are any questions, for me about immigration or identities or Jewishness or anything else, I'll just deal with this in questions because I can't really conclude.
Thank you for the two very dense, very intense, very detailed presentations to both of you. I would say, if I may, that it sounded to me like intersectional, transnational group portrait, a pretty fascinating one. And I would have a lot of questions, from detailed ones to bigger ones. I will start with the first one. Intersectionality was named. I was wondering, listening to both of you, we learned so much about those trajectories, but is there any queerness somewhere? Are there any, what about the sexuality and those aspects? That would be one question to both of you, out of such a big group of women with all the different forms of oppression endured. Secondly, once intersectionality was named again, I was so, do you know, could you tell us a bit more about the Jumri on the Sri Lanka and Ceylon in colonial context? Why Sri Lanka? For what reason she happened to be there? And could you tell us a bit more about how she interacted with the system of British oppression there at that time? Do we know anything about it? That would be two very curious and detailed questions. And speaking of much bigger and more methodological ones, I would love to know more about the ego documents you both were working with, and not to start with a very simple reason. With that, those transnational trajectories, what are the languages they use? And can we distinguish between documents, all the other documents conserved, written in the, like diary type, so written in the very moment? Because Clara, you mentioned numerous times memoirs or retrospective forms of narrative on their lives. So do you guys got some parallel documents, like correspondence letters, diaries from the very moment of the revolution, of the switching of the Europe to the States and so on and so forth, and retrospective views, as the interviews you mentioned, or the opinions of this difference? Is there a linguistic difference? Is there a form of difference? That would be one big question. And maybe as another one, in what form are nowadays their archives? Is there any, both or to both of you, is there any are there any attempts to centralize, to digitalize, to try to build some digital archive of those trajectories, be it from the psychoanalytical societies? Is there anyone taking care of it besides both of you? And I will stop here because, yeah, that's already a lot.
I also have too many questions, so I'll be selective. So, all right. One of my questions, it's not about sexuality, it's actually about it's a little bit the other way around. I remember reading this important book in Hungarian called Zsidó Gyónás, Jewish Confession, by a psychoanalyst who was not in the Freudian circle, named István Kulcsár, and he was talking about how his marriage, because he had married with a non-Jewish woman, had created for him sort of no man's land. That's how he would call it, but he said that actually it was a way to escape the the contradictions of the social cultural problems that he was entrenched in because of his Jewishness, because of his trade, and so forth. And you were mentioning, especially I was thinking about that listening to you, Clara, because you were talking about this 5 couples, if I understood correctly. And I know you want to focus on men, but out of curiosity, and the question can also be sent to Anna, because I know that there are some couples as well, probably. What do you make of, the unity of the marriage or even the family? Because in in your case, there's a mother and a daughter. So isn't it a locum, a place, a space, social space, I don't know, that could be worth looking into? And what can you tell us about that? So that was one thing. Another question that I have is, what do you know of their patients, these women's patients? Are they men, women, Jewish, non-Jewish? In Hungarian interwar, a lot of people were saying that psychoanalysis, the Freudian kind, was a Židodolog, a Jewish thing, that's, I'm quoting Untitled here. And that's what I found in many testimonies from writers. I'm as Agnieszka kindly said, I'm a specialist of Hungarian culture. My first book was on Hungarian Jewish writers in the interwar, and they were all struggling. And that leads me to a third question with identity questions, even though the word identity was not used as such, but they were obsessed with the collective and individual quest of identities, let's say. It was their horizon as social beings, as writers, and everything. And what you were saying on the beginning of at some point in your presentation, that they would the problematic of having various identities that are always problematic, especially the female and the Jewish one. I was wondering if there was a sort of prioritization in the self-reflection of these women, because if you look at women writers, it's a little bit more conscious or more outspoken in their works, that they speak about the feminine condition. The Jewish condition, they rather leave it to their male fellow writers to discuss in their books. So, and it feels to me that in your case is the other way around. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. I was fascinated, Clara, about what you said about the relationships between these women and the mothers, and reminding me, actually, that's something that is extremely common with the men. I was thinking of Peter Gay's famous study on the revolt of the son, and thinking to myself, why, it was written in 1968. And I was thinking to myself, why haven't we talked of the revolt of the daughter, And I think there's something here to do, because same generation, basically, as Helena Deutsch. And it is really fascinating. So thank you for that. One last question maybe is, it's again about Jewishness, and I'm sorry for that. But of course, it's something that I'm very much into. I was struck by what you said, Clara, about the fact that these women did not want to talk about the past, although they are psychoanalysts, right? It's paradoxical, to say the least. And didn't they have any patients that actually had that sort of traumas in the past, that they were, it had to work as a mirror to their own repression or traumas or silences, or I don't know. And how much can you explore that, given the sources that both of you have, because, yeah. And maybe the last, I don't know if Mateusz, you asked that, it's these women, I mean, but for a few of them that I heard of because of my Hungarian training, but still, I'm pretty sure that, as you said, I know 5%. So what's the legacy? What do you think of today's legacy? How much do we know? Is it thanks to you only? And, is it now this generation that is bringing out these women from out of oblivion? And do you already feel an impact of your research? That's all for me for now. And thank you again, both of you.
I will try to be really short. Thank you so much, Anna and Clara, for your very, very rich presentations. That actually, what really interests me, it's the way that biographical lines crosses psychoanalytical therapies, because you said that few of them are first patient before becoming theorists themselves. So it's very interesting how this therapy helped them somehow to afterwards being theoreticians. But what really interests me, it's two main things. The first is what Clara focused on. It's the social issue, because psychoanalysis is mostly dedicated to or from one social class, which is bourgeoisie or very high classes. And I was wondering how much these women, psychoanalysts, theorized or not the question of spreading psychoanalysis to other social classes, and how did they actually conceive psychoanalysis, if it's was only for one social class, or on contrary they conceive it as something broader. And the second issue that maybe it's really out of nowhere, but I was wondering if these women, because Clara also mentioned the question of sexology as Anna and Mateusz and also Clara mentioned this, but how combining these two fields of psychoanalysis and sexology, because somehow you mentioned this, but also in the whole issue and questioning about homosexuality back then. So I would like you to speak a little bit about this. Thank you so much.
There's so many questions. Where do we even start? Maybe we try it as a dialogue. I don't know. Okay, I'm going to start with. What am I going to start with? Sexuality. Question about their sexualities. So, or maybe it's like I do not know. I mean, that's kind of the quick answer is almost all of those 86 women I've been researching were married and had children. Few were single and didn't have children. Remained single throughout their lives. I really know about only one of them who was bisexual. And I know this through a conversation I had with someone who knew her. So definitely they were not open about if they were gay or bi, they were not open about it, I think. But that's, I'm in the middle of this research. So I haven't researched all 86 of them fully, but if I were to give an answer, that's more or less it. But they did, and that's something I mentioned before, they really didn't like to talk about their personal lives. And I think that's also part of I think I'm answering a few questions in a way. So when I'm doing this research and I'm reading about those women or talking about their children, grandchildren, so on, and listening to the interviews, I keep on thinking, did they identify as women? Did they identify as Jews? Did they identify as Poles or Galicians and Austrians and so on and so on? And of course, there's no simple answer. And I mean, that asking that is a mistake in a way, because their identities were incredibly complex and, multi-layered. But I think if I were to answer, I would say they identified as professional women. And along those lines, they didn't like to talk about their personal lives. They didn't like to talk about their families. And that's, of course, also due to the fact that they were trauma survivors, that all of them left someone behind in Europe, and some of them very close people. Many of them left their parents behind. Those parents would decide, okay, we are too old to immigrate, and they would stay behind. And many of them died in the Holocaust, in concentration camps, or simply even at home, but during the Holocaust. And so those women endured so many losses, like loss of their culture Like one of them, Judith Kestenberg, another one who was Polish, she's actually an exception because she's someone who made this turn and she started to work with Holocaust survivors, and really slowly, after years of, so her parents died in, her father died in Auschwitz and her mother died in Stanislavov in one of the massacres. And she was in the US already at that time. And then all of a sudden correspondence with her parents ceased. And then she just went into something that she called the latency period, where she didn't want to hear anything that had to do with the Holocaust, with the war, with Poland. And then after years, so you asked about patients. One of you asked about patients. So she was working with patients all that. So she had 2 children, one of them adopted when she was 40 something already. And she was working a lot. She was working all the time. It seems like basically to forget and to not think. And so she was working with patients. She was seeing them in hospital. She was seeing them in her office, and she was seeing them at home as well in Long Island. And so one of her patients, she realized that he behaves as, so this was someone who was a child during Shoah, and he behaved as if he was in a concentration camp toward her, like he treated her as an oppressor, he hid from her, he didn't eat, and so on, and so, like he starved himself. And she realized with this case that there's something that, I mean, she didn't coin the term, that's something that we know today is like intergenerational transmission of trauma. So she realized that, and with this, she all of a sudden joined her husband, who was a lawyer, but who worked with Holocaust survivors who were children during the Holocaust. So German courts refused any restitution because German courts would say, well, you didn't really suffer because you were just a baby. You don't remember, you don't have any trauma, so we're not going to help you. So he worked with them. So she joined him as a psychoanalyst in this work with this case. So this case opened, I wouldn't say her eyes, but he probably opened something in her, and she started reconnecting with her own traumas and experiences and losses. She was in therapy with Mari and Chris, for example, with Edith Buchsbaum, and she was in a number of therapies. And I completely lost my train of thought because I was trying to say a few things. But anyway, that's an exceptional case of someone who went back in a way to what had happened before and during the war. They usually wouldn't talk about this, and they wouldn't talk about their personal lives. So I hope I answered your questions in a way. I did try.
Can I just connect to Clara's presentation, because there were so many similarities. For example, in this mother, the relationship to the parents, the mother and the father. So it was like, I just recognized like Edith Gyömrői in her autobiography, and it also relates to the resources. She had this autobiographical novel, but it's definitely based on personal experiences. And she's writing a lot about her relationship to her mother, which was a very, very conflicted and even a neglective mother's and somehow an unloved and unwanted child experience. And the same is with Margaret Mahler. There is an autobiography or a memoir of Margaret Mahler, which in the first chapter she is talking about the Hungarian years and this kind of relationship, and she writes about this identification with the father and how she was kind of the son of her father. And in Hungarian we say she writes this, that there is this fiam, my son, which is used both for girls and boys somehow. So it was, and she's writing about how it was somehow confused her gender identity in a way, and she had to work on it. And perhaps this is the origin of her theoretical, somehow also of her theoretical interest. and also with Lily Hajdu as well. It was interesting that there were huge debates about women's access or admission to university, especially to the medical university, because it was somehow, it was thought to be in conflict with women's bodies even, or I don't know, reproductive organs. So it was really interesting discourses on that. And even in families like Lily Hajdu's families, where out of the 5 children, the two daughters went to university, the medical university, but there is a letter from the father, who was a merchant, so he was not an intellectual, but he was probably an open person. But in this letter, he expresses his moral worries about how these university experiences could make harm on his daughter's morals and mental health, maybe. So it was a very complex and changing period in this sense, and between the generations as well, and really big shifts between the generations. And as for the queers, I really I like to read with these queer eyes, but I didn't really find any traces. But I think it's a very difficult question of about how of self-identification and the question of sharing this kind of experiences. So we don't know about it too much. In Alice Balin's diaries, there's a lot about sexuality, her sexuality, because it was an analytic diary. So it was kind of obvious that she was talking about her sexuality, and it was kind of an expectation to enjoy sexuality and to a healthy woman, which was in a way in conflict of the contemporary expectations of a decent woman. So in a way, it couldn't be so easy to have an active and enjoyable sexual life, and she's writing about it quite openly, about her sexuality with Michael Balint and about the difficulties with that. But no, I didn't find any traces of homoeroticism. So yeah, I don't know that. The patients. I think it's also an area that is, since it's a very intimate situation and a very unless they didn't write case studies or didn't talk about it later in interviews, we know very little about what actually happened during the therapies and about the patients themselves. So I read one interview. It was given to me by Judith Mészáros, who made an interview with a man, actually a gay man, I guess, who was a patient of Alice Balint for a while and then emigrated. And he talked about her relationship to Alice Balint. But yeah, it's on the level of sociology or macro level, we know that it was a middle class, more or less middle class Jewish circle that was kind of receptive and more free, probably not only among the analysts, but among the patients as well, and mostly women. This is one of the basis of the the critics of psychoanalysis, that it's not a very representative sample of patients that can prove the effectiveness of psychoanalytic therapy and so on. But yeah, and the prioritization of identities, what Mathieu asked about the, I think the Jewish identity started to be important at the moment when it was made important by politics and the outside world. Otherwise, it was not, since they were really very much assimilated families, even in my cases, a lot of converted families, which didn't mean that they were religious Catholics or Unitarians or whatever, but it was a social, it was also part of the assimilation. Also Edith Gyömrői writes about this as well in her novel or autobiography, that how fake she felt even the parents' attitudes to religion, that they go to the synagogue on the holidays, and otherwise they don't really, even them, they don't have a real connection to the Jewish religion.
If I may, I'm sorry, I jump on this.
Of course, yeah.
But if I may, like, actually, from the moment there was this Jewish debate in this review called Who Said Század, you probably know that by heart, in 1917. And in the wake of the First World War, what they called the so-called Jewish question was really, all the writers of that generation, of the interwar generation, that I worked on, and it was 36 of them, that were all very much aware of what they call the failure of assimilation. It was not necessarily stemming from them, although it was internalized, because they were questioned, as their legitimacy to write in Hungarian, their authenticity to write about, to be part of the Hungarian literature and so forth were completely questioned. And I was wondering whether the sort of debates that were very pregnant in at least the literary field, and actually quite generally in the cultural one, were passing also in the psychoanalytic field, especially since those fields were so close. I mean, literature and psychoanalysis, Ferenc Ignotus, and the likes, that they were so interconnected that's why I'm a little bit surprised that it was not something that was way more diffused in a way. Thanks. Sorry for.
I mean, I think it was absolutely considered. So they knew knew of each other's Jewishness, and it was like somehow there in the background. But until I think, and psychoanalysis itself was considered kind of a Jewish science, and so it was compared to psychiatry, which was the Christian and real positivist science. So it was this both scientific and kind of religious or whatever shift, and so it was there, but it was not based on any kind of religious identification, but it was kind of a cultural or socio-cultural community, and yeah.
Could I say something?
Of course.
I mean, do we still have the time?
Yeah, we have, but still we need to conclude in about, I think, maximum 10 minutes.
I just wanted to answer some of the questions that I didn't.
Yes, of course.
Answer. Just stop me when it goes on too long. So one thing was, there was a question, I think, from Mateusz about documents, when were they written, and so there are rarely any, in the group of women I'm researching, rarely any documents from before immigration or during immigration, or even shortly after immigration. So the personal documents that I'm looking at, they're usually few years or decades after immigration. Those women also lived long lives. Like Helena Deutsch lived for 98 years, and that's quite typical. And so they would usually write memoirs late, or give interviews late, which is also due to the fact that no one was interested, which is so annoying, in interviewing those women in the 50s or even 60s. Like late 60s is when here, at least in America, they started interviewing those women. Some of them already gone, unfortunately, at that time. So I'm kind of guessing you were suggesting that what I'm working with is not facts, and that's absolutely true. These are histories and memoirs, and everything's twisted sometimes. But there are choices made about remembering something in a certain way. And then also I talk to their kids and grandchildren and so on, and they also remember something in a certain way. They remember their grandmother telling them something in a certain way, and so on and so on. So that's a question of cross-checking information. But because I'm very interested in how they felt, feelings are never wrong, right? Feelings are not fact. So this is something I think I can gather from what they wrote about themselves. So that's one thing. You were also asking about if there's any centralized effort, like any effort to centralize documents. Not that I know of in the States anyway, but the reason what I'm doing my research here is that they preserved those documents here. And for example, in Poland, they weren't preserved like this, also because there was a war in Poland, obviously, but here documents are being preserved. Like there's a big effort to preserve documents, and there were several oral history projects that, I mean, there still are, but that included the women I'm researching. But there are so many different archives, so many different places. Everything's pretty much scattered around. So that was another question. I think I also wanted to mention different question that Nancy Chodorov, she wrote this text about like the 70s questions for 30s women. I can't remember exactly. So she makes a point about how we, living, well, she wrote it as a 70s feminist, but we today look at the past through our lens, and we look for queer theory or gender theory and Jewishness and and all of those things. And what comes across from my research that totally agrees with what she realized is that those categories really didn't exist, and those women, even though they were absolute pioneers of medicine and psychoanalysis and incredible women, they didn't really see themselves as that. They really tried, and I think there was a conscious effort, at least sometimes, to not say, okay, I'm the first. I mean, this is something that annoys me today too. Why do we always have to say this was the first woman to do it when we never say that was the first man to do it? And I think they refuse to do that. Some of them, anyway. Greta Bibring, for sure. Like Greta Bibring was a feminist. From my perspective, she would never call herself a feminist, and she never did, according to her family anyway. It's never written anyway. And I think, wait, I had one more thing I wanted to say. Oh, about Jewishness, just to add to what Anna was saying. I think like so many of those women I'm researching, they really didn't see themselves as Jewish. They had no religious identity. There were usually, well, the vast majority of the 86 were completely non-religious. So that's one thing, right? And then they saw themselves as Austrians if they studied and lived and worked in Austria, or as Germans, and so on and so on. And so also that's also why they didn't immigrate early. And that's also why the immigration was so turbulent or more difficult, or they wouldn't immigrate at all because it was too late. Because even though everything, what was happening with Hitler coming to power and everything else that we know was happening, they didn't think they would be targets of it. They didn't expect to be targeted. And that also actually includes Sigmund Freud and many other men, psychoanalysts. They really didn't think that, they knew of the anti-Jewish campaigns, they just didn't see themselves as Jewish. Like they saw themselves mostly as, for example, Austrian. Like they grew up in Austro-German culture and they admired it, and philosophy and art and literature, and they saw themselves as, you know, German-speaking intellectuals, not as Jews who will be targeted. And they also questioned, they also didn't believe that the Nazis, Germans who created this culture, would be or are capable of the atrocities. I think that's all I just wanted to quickly add.
That was their tragedy, actually.
Okay, so thank you.